Hello, Professor Ariana Vigil. So it's really a pleasure to have you here. So I would like to introduce Ariana, Professor Ariana Vigil, um, who, who will deliver her speech, which has the title of New Perspectives on GLORIA ANZALDÚA, Poetry, Pedagogy, and Language. Um, Ariana Vigil is an associate professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She is the author of What Echoes Gender and Militarization in the U.S. Latina Cultural Production, which was published in 2014. She conducts teaching and research in contemporary Latina cultural production, focusing on issues of gender and sexuality, militarization, and transnationalism. Her work has appeared in Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism, Latino Studies, and Revista de Literatura Mexicana Contemporánea. She is currently working a project that places Latina literature in conversation with media and communication studies. Welcome, Professor, and feel at ease to deliver your speech. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. Um, Professor Joao, I might have given you an old biography. That book came out a couple of years ago, thankfully. So the most recent publication was published. Excuse me, I'm a little sick today, so I will do my best. And I'm going to go ahead. I've never used this format, but I'm going to share screen and hopefully you'll be able to see. Hopefully you can see my presentation. Is that, let me see. How do I do this? I want to share my PowerPoint. Is there a way to do that? Or Joao, should I send it to you?
Oh, yes, yes. I think.
What's the best? I hit share. I'm sorry.
Yes.
And then,
Did you hit share?
It's a PowerPoint that I want to share.
Yeah.
So let me see. Okay, what if let me know. Okay, so let me know if you see this.
Okay.
Let's see. Can you see that?
Not yet.
Can you see a PowerPoint? No.
Not yet.
I
just know that it's next to the Canon mic and this.
Yeah, no, it seems like it will let me share. Okay, let me try one other thing. It seems like it will let me share seems like it will let me share a window, like an internet window.
Yeah.
Really a document. I have an idea though. Hold on. I think I can just, excuse me. I'm sorry about the technical.
That's all right.
Problem.
Bound to just know when you hit share on the two options that you can share the video and the screen, right?
Yeah. So it feels like if I hit screen, then it was sharing like my internet browser.
Yeah, I think that's the way that you have to do. I'm not quite sure.
Okay, I have an idea.
Okay.
I can do this. If you'll hold one moment, excuse me. I can do it this way. Okay, excuse me. I think this might work. If not, we'll do it without it. One second. Let's see if it'll go Come on. Well, I don't want to spend. Let me try one more thing.
I think Marlon has to let you do that.
Okay, let me try one other thing. Okay, let me try this. I think I might can do it.
All right.
Window. Okay. Does that work?
Yes, I think. Yes.
You can see that?
Yes. Awesome. Brilliant.
Okay. I'll get through this. Everyone, and thank you for bearing with me while I figured that out. I've never used this platform, but it's great. It looks like it's working. It's a great way to do a conference. Thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Ariana Vigil. Thank you for the introduction. I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. My plan today is to talk for about 30 minutes and then hopefully have some time for a discussion with you. So my goal today is to offer some new and novel perspectives on the work of GLORIA ANZALDÚA, including new avenues in Anzaldúan studies, as well as how her work is being taken up within classrooms and across languages and disciplines. My goal is to showcase recent work in the field and to point your attention to areas that I think are deserving of more scholarly attention. And I will focus on 3 areas: poetry, pedagogy, and language. So we'll start with poetry. Anzaldúa is most well known for her 1987 book, Borderlands La Frontera, which is almost always discussed as a multi-genre work. However, while the text is noted for its combining of literary genres, including memoir, autobiography, essay, and prose, for decades, studies of Anzaldúa's work has primarily focused only on her prose, right? So everybody mentions the fact that Borderlands is multi-genre, but in practice, the vast majority of the scholarship on Anzaldúa ignores her poetry. So today I'd like to highlight the significance of Anzaldúan scholarship on poetry and argue for her central place as a Chicana feminist poet. So existing scholarship on Anzaldúa's poetry can be roughly divided into 2 categories. The first category is work that focuses on analyses of imagery and representation. And the second category is work that argues for the poetry's intervention into established discourses and practices. And I will discuss these 2 categories separately. So I'll start with the first category, readings that focus on issues of imagery and representation. So some examples of scholarship that does this are a 2010 article by George Hartley, a 2003 article by Domino René Perez, and a 2000 article by Carmen Caliz. And these authors analyze the poems Matriz sin tumba, My Black Angelos, and Poets Have Strange Eating Habits. In his 2010 article, George Hartley reads Matriz sin tumba, or Womb Without a Tomb, in relation to Tlazolteotl, the goddess of lust and filth, who is one of Coatlicue manifestations. Analyzing the alternative title of the poem, which is O el baño de la basura ajena, the bath of other people's trash, Hartley argues that the poem reflects, quote, Anzaldúa's struggle against the mainstream patriarchal Anglo-American conversion of the mestiza's womb or matrix into mere trash. Hartley's analysis of the Spanish language poem relies on engagement with Chicana feminist theorizing of the body, and also includes discussions of Anzaldúa's own discourses about the pain that she herself experienced. He relies heavily on a discussion of the Coatlicue state and connects Matriz sin tumba to earlier discussions in Borderlands, including Anzaldúa's discussion of her hysterectomy. Domino Rene Perez's 2003 article analyzes My Black Angelos, and similar to Hartley's piece, she looks at indigenous references in the text, specifically Aztec antecedents to La Llorona. According to Perez, Anzaldúa, quote, frees this legendary figure from the patriarchal constructions of her as a sexual and physical threat by recontextualizing her within the Aztec pantheon to create an empowered female personage who does far more than weep and wander. The author engages with scholarship on La Llorona, as well as discussions of La Llorona's connection to Coatlicue, Tonatzin, and Tlazolteotl, and argues that by embracing La Llorona, the narrator is embracing indigenous aspects of herself that she had been taught to fear. And the last piece I'll discuss in this section is an article published in 2000 by Carmen Caliz, which analyzes animalistic imagery in Poets Have Strange Eating Habits, focusing on the figure of the mare, the eagle, and the serpent. Joining Hartley and Perez in contextualizing symbolism in the poem in relation to Aztec mythology, Caliz argues that when the female speaker of the poem becomes pregnant with the mare's seed, the piece echoes the impregnation of Coatlicue. Caliz draws from Western tradition in her analysis as well, discussing not only indigenous figures such as Coatlicue, but also Medusa and Perseus. The poem, she argues, quote, combines Western European and ancient American cultural traditions and myths, and is a vehicle for the reconstruction of myth in the borderlands. So the second set of scholarly articles that focus on Anzaldúa's poetry that I'd like to talk about focus less explicitly on the poet's engagement with indigenous and non-indigenous deities, but instead analyzes how her work engages with the relationships between human and non-human animals, and with processes of colonialism and healing. And so some examples of these are articles by Kate Adams, one by myself, and one by Amanda Ellis. And the articles analyze the poems La Curandera, Cervicide, Horse, We Call Them Greasers, Yo No Fui Fuetate, and White Wing Season. In her earlier 1994 article, Kate Adams analyzes Cervicide, Horse, and White Wing Season. The author is particularly concerned with the way that the poems portray conflict between a white male world of alienation and one more connected to animals, nature, and spirit. She argues that violence and destruction in the world is linked to white male power that is blind to its own destruction, and that Chicanas are portrayed as, quote, negotiating the law of white power and the law of a living landscape, or as betraying their balanced relation to the natural world. In my 2016 article, I look at 3 poems. We Call Them Greasers, Cervicide, and Yo No Fui Fuitate. Moving away from a discussion of indigeneity, but maintaining a focus on embodiment, I connect these poems with heterosexualization. I argue that Anzaldúa's poems take up issues of gender, violence, and sexuality in such a way that they connect processes of racialized heterosexualization from the conquest to our present moment. Engaging with terrifying and painful histories of violence and dispossession in the poems, my overall argument is that the poems exhort us to understand sexual violence not only as a state crime, but as a state creating process as well. So I'll take some presenter's privilege and go into a little more detail about how I articulate this argument in my article. So I'll just give you a taste of a close reading of the poem Cervicide. So Cervicide is a prose poem. So it's written in, it looks more like a paragraph, but it's in the poetry section of the book. And the poem portrays the growing power of Anglo settlers through a clash between ranching families that are closely connected to their land and animals, and invaders who want to harness and exploit human and non-human animals. And the work narrates the killing of a family's pet fawn by the young daughter Prieta, of course, Anzaldúa's alter ego. The omniscient speaker explains that the family is threatened by the impending arrival of, quote, the game warden with his hounds, who will put su papi in la cárcel when they cannot pay the $250 fine. After exploring several options, the speaker concludes that she, Prieta, would have to be the one to kill La Venadita, which she does by clubbing the fawn with a hammer in the shed behind the house. Prieta then buries the fawn just before the warden arrives. He finds nothing and leaves. Cervicide emphasizes violence enacted within a domestic space and the accumulated effect of heteropatriarchal state and familial power. Prieta succumbs to the needs of her male-headed household, which is itself threatened by the Anglo state. The violence in servicide is state-backed. The impending presence of the game warden in the poem reflects the encroachment of the state on the lives of Mexicano peoples, while the gendering of both the young girl and the Venadita marks this violence as one that has specific ramifications for female gendered beings. While for contemporary readers, the murder of the fawn may seem inexplicable and unnecessary, placing the violence within processes of state formation allows us to understand the poem's narration of the relationship between violence and modernity. In making punishment for the possession of a fawn, either incarceration or payment of a large sum of cash, the Anglo state threatens Mexicanos with the loss of freedom or participation in a cash-based economy. While capital and economics undergird the poem, the focus on the actions of a young girl and a female-identified deer emphasize the significance of gender. Through gendered language, the poem comments on the intertwinement of neocolonial power, economic disenfranchisement, state formation, and sexual and gender violence. Let's look at the opening lines that I have here. The very first line of the poem reads, La Venadita, the small fawn. And then with no explanation, the reader then tells us the game warden was on the way with his hounds. Readers are presented with a female-identified animal threatened by a male representative of the state. The reference to the hounds recalls the dogs that accompanied the Spanish conquistadors, encouraging readers to see the game warden as a more recent iteration of colonial violence. In addition, portraying the game warden or the colonizer as a threat to female gendered beings, including both Prieta and the female fawn, we are called on to acknowledge the role of gender in colonialism and how economic threats exacerbate systemic violence. Here we see how the game warden imposes a gendered order that is used to bolster the power of the state. The result is a specifically Chicana feminist perspective that understands how the regulation and stratification of gender and sexuality are integral components, as well as results of state formation. And then finally, a more recent article that looks at Anzaldúa's poetry is Amanda Ellis's 2017 article, which analyzes La Curandera. And she places this discussion in relationship to Chicana literary engagements with healing. For Ellis, the poem theorizes, quote, border arte as medicine. And by focusing on the poem, she argues that the piece allows us to, quote, chart a distinctly Anzaldúan legacy that situated border artists and border arte itself as the transformative power of curandismo and its importance in Chicana writing. So this section has offered a brief, but by no means exhaustive review of scholarship on Anzaldúa's poetry. My aim is to encourage audience members to engage in their own analyses of Anzaldúa's poetic works. There is much to be done in this area, and several fruitful avenues for research would explore her poetry, not only in relation to her prose work, but also in relation to her visual art, which I have used a little bit of in these slides, and you'll see more later on. I also think scholars who are interested in analyzing her poetry might be well served if they're able to utilize the archive, Anzaldúa's archive, which is contained at the University of Texas at Austin, where they can view drafts of much of these works. Anzaldúa was somewhat obsessive in writing and rewriting, and so almost all of her works have many, many drafts of them, some of them quite different from their original pieces. So I'm going to turn now to my next section, which is on pedagogy. Those of us who have taught Anzaldúa in the classroom know how important and transformative her work can be, particularly for multilingual, first-generation, queer, and Chicanx and Latinx students. Scholarship on pedagogical approaches to Anzaldúa is marked by deep interdisciplinarity, as scholars from the fields of rhetoric, women's and gender studies, ethnic studies, and other fields discuss classroom considerations and approaches. For the purposes of today's presentation, I will focus on how Anzaldúa's work allows for necessary interventions in the realm of race and decoloniality two topics of conversation that are very present, on contemporary college campuses. In their 2015 article, Sarah Klotz and Carl Whithouse discussed teaching Anzaldúa in an undergraduate rhetoric classroom. The authors discuss how students found Anzaldúa's emphasis on a tolerance for ambiguity useful in their multiracial classroom, and explained that the rhetoric of ambiguity was key to, quote, understanding how students experienced the intersections of race, ethnicity, religious backgrounds, and gender and sexual orientation. Moreover, when the teachers encouraged their teachers to participate in knowledge production, they put Anzaldúan theory into practice while also generating new possibilities for anti-racist discourse. While scholars and teachers have found that Anzaldúa's concept of a tolerance for ambiguity is particularly applicable in classrooms where racial identities exceed those of Black and white, more recent scholarship has also discussed pedagogical approaches that engage directly with anti-Blackness and questions of coloniality. Just last year, the University of Arizona Press published an anthology entitled Teaching GLORIA ANZALDÚA, Pedagogy and Practice for Our Classrooms and Communities, edited by Margaret Cantu Sanchez, Candice de Leon Cepeda, and Norma Cantu. The volume includes sections devoted to curriculum, praxis, and pedagogies, and several pieces place Anzaldúan pedagogy directly in relation to recent social justice and decolonial movements. In one piece, Alteria Caldera speaks of using Anzaldúa's work in relation to young Black girls. She contextualizes her article within the studies of Black academic achievement and the ways in which racialized oppositionality presents a barrier to Black high achievement. She points to, for example, how academic achievement by young Black students is often accompanied by the questioning of students' identities, by calling them Oreos or by questioning their Blackness or accusing them of acting white. Cadera argues that Anzaldúa's theorization regarding identity can help teachers support an expansive, rather than compartmentalized and fragmented approach to students' identities, while also respecting individual agency and affirming the shifting nature of identity. So the idea here is to, equip teachers with the tools to, give their students the space to be everything they are. In this case, both a young Black girl who's academically high achieving, as well as, other identities, without needing to, have these students fit into small boxes that limit their academic achievements, in relation to just the racist pressures that they're under. Caldera explains that such approaches are necessary for Black girls in particular, who face specific kinds of racism, including adultification, which is the perception that young Black girls are more adult-like than childlike. While much scholarship on teaching Anzaldúa naturally focuses on Latinx spaces, Caldera's article is useful for showcasing how Anzaldúa's ideas may be used outside of such a context. The last section of Teaching GLORIA ANZALDÚA focuses on decolonial methods and practices. And Norma Cantu explains in her introduction that Chicana educators have been involved in decolonial practices, although we tended to use terminology like anti-colonial, right, previously. She also explains that education was key to colonial missions, as classroom spaces were sites where the colonized were taught the ways of the colonizer. In her piece in the volume, Carolina Alonso discusses her experience of teaching borderlands to first-year students at Fort Lewis College in Colorado, which is a Native American-serving non-tribal institution where 170 American Indian tribes and Native Alaskan villages are represented amongst the student population. Alonso offers an example of how her students relate to essays from borderlands, such as The Homeland Aslan and How to Tame a Wild Tongue. She shares that when discussing gender-based violence in Latinx and Chicanx communities, students broach the high rates of violence against Native American women. Students also respond to Anzaldúa's discussion of linguistic terrorism with reflections on their own practices of introducing themselves first in the language of their ancestors, and also the violent history of the attempted erasure of Indigenous languages through US state-sponsored boarding schools. The importance of language in approaches to teaching Anzaldúa will be taken up more explicitly in the last section of my presentation. For several of the contributors, including Caldera discussed earlier, the concept of nepantla, which was discussed in the previous presentation, is important because it allows readers and educators to appreciate the shifting nature of identity. Nepantla is similarly central to another piece in the collection, And my discussion of this last piece will serve as a transition from the discussion of pedagogy to my final discussion of Anzalduan studies outside of the United States. Three scholars, Nina Joto, Rian Lozano, and Maria del Socorro Gutierrez Magallanes, discuss what it has been like to co-teach borderlands at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, La UNAM, where they've been doing that since 2014. The authors, who describe themselves as feminists, artists, researchers, curators, and professors, rely on the notion of Nepantla, or the in-between space, to talk about the spaces, geographical, disciplinary, and linguistic, that they inhabit. They stress the process of unlearning that they engage in with their students and offer an example of a classroom exercise in which they ask students to perform a piece by Anzaldúa. They conclude their piece with a series of testimonios offered in untranslated Spanish, discussing how Anzaldúa's work, including her visual works, have impacted them. This section has looked briefly at pedagogical approaches to teaching Anzaldúa. In order to connect with current conversations in academic and activist spaces, I focused on discussions of decoloniality and confronting anti-Blackness. And the last article I mentioned about teaching Anzaldúa in a seminar in Mexico City also again broaches an area of scholarship that we may wish to explore, which is again looking at Anzaldúa's visual work. So the authors talk about teaching Anzaldúa's drawings and sketches, and I think that that's something that I haven't seen very much scholarship on, and so I think that's another area that would be great to be explored. So I'm going to move on now to my third and final discussion section, which is going to look at how scholars outside of the United States have taken up Anzaldúa and her work, and this is going to dovetail both with questions of pedagogy as well as with questions of language. So in the pedagogy article I just explored about teaching GLORIA ANZALDÚA at La UNAM in Mexico City, the co-authors contextualize their use of Anzaldúa in the classroom with a longer history of Anzaldúa herself and her work in Mexico. So they discuss a seminar at the Centro de Investigaciones sobre América del Norte, the CISAN, which is part of La UNAM, a seminar that was taught in 1992. And then they also talk about an interview that Anzaldúa did with CISAN researcher Claire Joy-Smith in 1993. And I want to pause here and highlight the work of Claire Joy-Smith, who is a professor at La UNAM and who works on Chicana literature and who's done a lot to bring Chicana literature and GLORIA ANZALDÚA to Mexican audiences. As one example, in 2005, she, along with her co-editor, Clara Lomas, published an anthology of Latinx testimonios in the wake of September 11th. And the bilingual anthology was published by the UNAM, along with Colorado College and Whittier College, and includes an article by Anzaldúa entitled Let Us Be the Healing of the Wound, the Coyolxauhqui Imperative, La Sombra y el Sueño. And Joy Smith has also been instrumental in bringing the work of, so she's been instrumental in bringing the work of Chicana feminists and Anzaldúa specifically to a Mexican culture, to a Mexican audience, excuse me. And more recently, in 2016, the Casa de Cultura Universidad Autónoma del Estado de México in Tlalpan, Mexico City, hosted an exhibit dedicated to Anzaldúa entitled Entre Palabra y Imagen, Galería de Pensamiento de GLORIA ANZALDÚA. And you can see the picture there at the top. I was able to attend that, that exhibit, which was great. And again, there was a lot of focus on her visual work, which is now, I see that being exhibited more, but I still think would be great to see more scholarship on that field. Scholarship devoted to discussing Anzaldúa outside of the United States tends to dovetail with questions of pedagogy, as is made clear in a 2011 article by Maria Enriquez Betancourt about teaching Anzaldúa at the Universidad de Las Palmas de Gran Canaria in the Canary Islands. Enriquez Betancourt explains that the Canary Islands are one of the most multicultural and multi-ethnic areas of Spain. Nevertheless, this diversity is often underrepresented at the university. Focusing on women's literature, the professor notes that she faces the paradox of, quote, having mostly female students who have never felt, thought about, or imagined the concept of the borderlands, but who are very much living in several of them. Offering specific examples of students who are neither at home in the Canaries nor have another home to return to, Enriquez Betancourt asks, what would it be like if, quote, Many more women on this Atlantic island learned about the benefits of Anzaldúa's self-analysis within the community she belonged to, and she affirms Anzaldúa's exhortation that by changing ourselves, we change the world. Excuse me, I do have a dog with me. And I just want to add that Enriquez Betancourt's article came from a special issue of the journal Science, which was published in fall 2011 and edited by Norma Cantu. And the entire journal is devoted to international perspectives on Anzaldúa and includes perspectives from Spain, from Mexico, from Austria, the Czech Republic, Poland, and the Ukraine. Okay, and finally, I want to turn to the question of language. These questions of teaching Anzaldúa outside of the United States invariably invoke the question of language. In their article about teaching borderlands in Mexico City, Joto, Lozano, and Gutierrez Magallanes suggest that we may understand the 2001 Spanish translation of Anzaldúa's piece La Prieta into Spanish in the journal Debate Feminista as a moment in which Anzaldúa herself returned to the country. In 2015, Norma Cantu published a translation of Borderlands with the UNAM. And just this year, Capitan Swing Libros has published a new translation, so a translation into Spanish by Carmen Valle. In her introduction, Valle discusses the difficulties in translating a text that engages in so much code switching and wordplay. And she also acknowledges the gendered constraints built into standard Spanish, as well as the ways in which reflecting gender diversity have changed since the original text was published in the 1980s. Valle also reflects on the necessity of capturing the hybrid nature of the text. She explains that she engages in a strategy she calls contratraducción, counter-introduction, in which she leaves certain words whose meaning is likely intelligible in English in the original. The challenge, which those of us who teach Borderlands in the original language know, is to allow readers to engage with the text as it is, but also to offer them enough tools to understand Anzaldúa's work that they do not feel compelled to set the work aside. Okay, so just a brief conclusion. My talk today has sought to offer a brief overview of recent interventions in Anzaldúan scholarship, focusing specifically on scholarship devoted to her poetry, to pedagogical approaches to Anzaldúa's studies, and to how Anzaldúa's work is being taken up outside of the United States and outside of the English language. I hope I have both honored the important work that the scholars I discuss here have done and inspired you to conduct research in these areas. Thank you. So I think I stopped sharing. Hopefully you can still hear me, and I'd be happy to engage in conversation with you or take any questions or comments you might have.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to have you here, Professor Ariana Vigil. Can I call you Vigil or Vigil?
It's Vigil.
Vigil. Thank you so much. Well, it's really interesting to think from this critical pedagogy, which makes me feel how Borderlands it is so transfrontier, yeah, transdisciplinary, which traveled between many disciplines. Yes, it was my perception listening to your speech. But I would like to talk about the poetry, GLORIA ANZALDÚA's poetry, because it was one of the things that made me feel really uncomfortable when I was writing my thesis. And your writing, because I am translating, yes, one of your articles, was really an inspiration for me because when I was writing my thesis, it seemed that I was listening to Gloria Anzaldúa telling me, so aren't you going to talk about my poems? And it was one of my concerns, maybe because I'm not used to poetry, maybe I'm not at, I could feel that I wasn't so comfortable when I thought about analyzing Gloria Anzaldúa's poetry. And when I ran, when I read you, yes, this article where you talk about um, uh, three of Gloria Anzaldúa's poems, um, it was like a shake. So, and it made me feel that I could analyze her poems and talk about um, these local histories. Yeah, and I would also like to introduce one of these Brazilian authors. He's a poet Cesar Nolasco, Edgar Cesar Nolasco here in Brazil, who tries to reflect. He brings this conception of desmemoria. Now I will try to translate into English because it's like poetic but depoetic at the same time. I don't know if you can understand me, but he tries to make some distance from the poetry which are written in the center, thinking about this poetry um, constructed from the margins. Yeah, and uh, we can think about this mestizaje poetry. So, Professor Vigil, I would like you to make some comments about these concerns when we are before uh, poetry, and at the same time that because some of the studies we do not see so much so many authors intellectuals talking about Gloria Anzaldúa's poetry, especially here in Brazil. So it was something that intrigued me so much, and because of your writing, it it gave me some courage to talk about her poetry.
Well, thank you so much. So there was also a few years ago, I met a scholar based in Spain who was doing some work, and I think she eventually never published this article, but she was telling me that Borderlands was originally entirely poetry. That Anzaldua's original plan for Borderlands was a complete volume of poetry, and I'm not sure at one point maybe it got combined with another text, but obviously it came out with the multi-genre work, and so I just think that's really interesting and to follow maybe Anzaldua's own lead for how she herself identified and how poetry was so important to her. So I think we would do her more justice, right, by reading her poetry. And I know that for a long time, in terms of teaching Anzaldúa as well, I oftentimes even skip over the poetry, right? That there's so much compelling work. The prose is just so important. It teaches us so many lessons. It broaches so many conversations that I think a lot of educators don't even teach the poetry. So I've had to um, yeah, alter how I teach Borderlands in insisting on teaching poetry. Or if we do teach poetry, the only poem we teach is the last one when when you live in the Borderlands, you. So I just think it would take a little bit of a sort of change in how we think about Anzaldúa. I also think it's a larger question about how we value poetry, right? So there's been a lot of Anzaldúa herself has been taken up um, in a lot of different disciplines, right? And so I see her discussed in religious studies, and I see her discussed in philosophical studies. I see her discussed as a theorist, and I think there's a sense within the academy that we are honoring somebody more if we identify them as a theorist or as a scholar or as a thinker, and that poets are not that there's something else. And I think that's also wrong. I think we should push against our own idea that poets are philosophers and poets are that is an an honored way to talk about somebody, to take that seriously, right? So I think we have to maybe alter how we ourselves think about her poetry. And then, I could just say, in terms of my own scholarship, I think I was really interested, to be honest, I wasn't necessarily interested in the poetry. I'm trying to remember now how I came to it. I was actually really interested in talking about state-backed heterosexualization and violence and how that played in. But it just seems so apparent in the poetry. And it's something that actually doesn't come up in her prose in that same way. So there are issues that she broaches in her poetry that she doesn't broach in her prose. And so I think we would just, pay attention to that. And I hope I empower other people that you can do it. You can analyze the poetry. In many ways, Anzaldúa studies, I think to write about Gloria Anzaldúa can be a little bit daunting because she is such an important figure and there is so much written about her, but there's very little written about her poetry. So there's space for new scholars.
Oh, something happened. A gente.
João, eu gostaria que você falasse, né? Você traduzisse para ela, tá? Primeiramente, nós gostaríamos de agradecer a sua fala, né? É uma estudiosa, uma pesquisadora, uma ativista, né? Uma escritora. Foi com muito prazer, né? Que nós ouvimos as considerações dela, o trabalho, né, que ela realiza, especialmente sobre sexualidade. Você pode falar, porque depois eu vou fazer uma questão para ela.
Professor Van Guerra would like to congratulate about your studies and what have you been discussing along in academia, and the activism that we can notice when you are talking about Gloria Anzaldúa's works. She's got a question. Just a moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professora, as suas questões tocam muito a questão da transnacionalidade, transnacionalismo, né? Eu gostaria que a senhora colocasse para nós, né, como é esse enfoque, né, dentro da perspectiva dos estudos anzalduanos, né, da sua perspectiva, por favor.
Did you understand?
I understand a little. It's
yeah,
perspective on transnationalism.
Yes. How do you discuss the transnationalism? Well, taking into consideration the Anzaldúa's studies.
Yeah. So I think if I understand this question correctly, I think it does go back to the question of language and identity that I think has come up a little bit more in this conference over the last day and a half. So I think there is a sense that I almost sometimes feel like there's a little bit of argument about who Anzaldúa belongs to, right? And so for those of us who are Chicanas, we identify very strongly with Anzaldúa, and it was one of the first times, to see her venerated, to see her works published. It does a lot of, it affirms, as the last presenter was talking about, it affirms Chicano Spanish, right? It affirms a lot of our identity and the ways in which our culture. But I think that's not to discount how much Anzaldúa can offer to audiences outside of the United States and outside of the US-Mexico borderlands. So I think, I think it would be interesting to sort of go back a little bit more and think, and to place Anzaldúa, sort of back within third world feminism, back within the Asian American, African American, Native American movements that she was working with, and to understand the place of transnationalism and internationalism within those movements, which I think Anzaldúa has gotten so much, just going back to like making face, making soul, haciendo cara, and going back to this bridge called My Back. She was always a coalitional figure, right? And so maybe even sort of moving her outside the US-Mexico borderlands to think about where she fits in the world. And again, even her work on borderlands, though, I think that is a place where things have been successful, like the ways in which she's theorized borders, that work has been taken up transnationally, right? That we see the ways in which her insights about the US-Mexico border are applied to Palestine, right? Are applied to European borders, are applied to other places. And so I think that's maybe, thinking about where she fits in that world might be a way to, encourage more transnationalism work. But I think the question of language too, frankly, I feel bad that I'm presenting in English at this conference. And I think, thinking a little bit more about how we engage with language, the question of translation, I think is just really important. We're never gonna get away from that if we're only sort of working in the English language.
Thank you, teacher. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's welcome to Brazil when you can, when you desire. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Would Carlos like to say something?
There's also a question about cultural appropriation in the chat.
Oh, okay.
I've been trying
to awesome.
As best as I can.
Thank you.
There were some comments from somebody who teaches Anzaldúa in Poland. Thank you very much, Professor, for being here and listening. So yeah, the question of cultural appropriation, I think, is super interesting too, right? Because I think as Chicanas and Latinas, like, we want Anzaldúa to belong to us, we want her to belong to the world, but how do you do that work? How do you do it right, I guess, right? How do you do it carefully to pay attention to the specificities of where Anzaldúa is coming from in terms of race and class? I think I encountered this a little bit in the gender studies classroom with, I'll speak a little bit like with the concept of intersectionality, right? When I teach students about intersectionality, students, sometimes that concept gets a little bit watered down to mean just like, oh, well, everybody has multiple identities, and it's a little bit more complicated than that. But to go back to the question of cultural appropriation, I guess what we would need to do is, do justice to where Anzaldúa is coming from. And maybe I think following the lines of some of the pedagogy pieces is ask students to speak from their own perspective. So, how do they inhabit borderlands? Or how do they engage in code switching? Or what are their experiences with linguistic terrorism? I think exercises like that allow us to apply Anzaldúa's theories and ideas without sort of going so diffuse that there's no sort of cultural context whatsoever. And those are experiences that I've had. I've had really, really good experiences with that. I'll offer one other teaching anecdote that I often do, because I know the last presentation talked about how to tame a wild tongue, which is such an impactful essay. One thing I've done with my students is I've asked them to read that essay and then to write their linguistic autobiography. So I asked them to write down what languages they speak, and I asked them to write down what languages don't they speak and why that, and to contend with some of that history. And it's a really amazing exercise, especially if you have a classroom with, first generation students, with children of immigrants, with international, binational students, because they'll talk about, being the children of immigrants and, not speaking good Spanish or not speaking good English. And it becomes such a powerful, powerful way for the students to connect with that text. And it never becomes irrelevant. And the students who only speak one language, they have to think about that, right? Like, why do they only speak one language? What opportunities, were denied to them, or what is their relationship to dominant culture that they never had to learn another language?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We would like one more time to thank you for your presence in this symposium. It was really a pleasure to hear you talk. And I do think that when we publish the translation of your article, will be a way of bridging, yeah, our knowledge. So thank you one more time. Would you like to say uh, something else? The final
No,
word?
I will put my email in the chat.
Of
And I'd
course.
love to, if anybody, you're welcome to write to me. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Professora?
Bom, eu acho que encerramos, né, a nossa manhã, né, com os nossos palestrantes do dia de hoje e mais à tarde, né, 14 horas, horário de Brasília, 13 horas, Mato Grosso do Sul, nós retornamos com as comunicações e depois com o mini curso, né? Até mais, então, pessoal. João?
Agradecemos. Até mais. À tarde nós teremos, né, as comunicações e esperamos todos vocês por lá. Obrigado.